Leading Entrepreneurs of the World, our 2022 conference. We are now joined by Karl Alomar. He is the managing partner of M13. And Karl's topic today is Web3 the future? The utility of Web3 outside of currency. Karl, good morning. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Glenn.
Let me hand it off to you.
Okay, let me jump in. I'll start up some slides. So welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be back here and present a little story about Web3 for everybody. Maybe just to get started, let's start with who I am and why I'm giving this talk. So I'm actually a serial entrepreneur. I'm 20 years of operating. I had two businesses that I founded, which both exited, and then a company I joined called DigitalOcean back in 2013 that I was chief operating officer for and ran until the end of 2018, after which I left and joined M13 as a managing partner and as a venture capital investor. We at M13 do a bunch of investments in Web3, but having said that, I came from DigitalOcean, which is really a core infrastructure player in the Web2 space. And so understanding the demand of a Web2 cloud and Web2 infrastructure, and then seeing that transition into demand around Web3 is really the essence and the basis of which, I really come to this conversation here. And so it's always a very, very interesting challenge to think about the evolution of technology and how and if new technology is actually outstripping an old or replacing an old or simply complementing an old. And so what we want to do here is really go through a little bit of a history of Web3 and talk about how it's utilized, what kind of companies use it, and how it works either alongside or perhaps replaces Web2 or even Web1. So just, I guess, to kick off, let's start with a simple, trip down memory lane. What is Web1? Well, Web1 was really the dawn of the internet. Everything was really controlled by servers in Office. It was very basic, very simple. And the general theme of it was driving access. It gave the common consumer access to information and services that they never would have had access to before. It really cut out a lot of the logistics and problems related to delivering that kind of value to consumers. And you saw the birth of Google, Amazon. If we go back to those days, you had Netscape, you had Yahoo, obviously, which is still very strong, AOL. So all of these were really kind of either information hubs or basic service hubs, single point of, I want to buy books on Amazon, or I want to, book a holiday, or I want to do something that is very direct. It was really isolated to the desktop. There was very, very early moments of mobile computing, but it was all desktop oriented mobile computing. And so it was a relatively restricted environment. I mean, in the day, it was revolutionary and it felt totally unrestricted. But as we've seen technology evolve, we begin to see how those restrictions get removed. So Web2 really kind of dawned in the 2000s. And there was a couple of key technical advancements that allowed for it. The first one was this concept of both on demand from a service provision standpoint, as well as a consumer standpoint. So from service provision, we now started to see cloud infrastructure. DigitalOcean obviously was a big player in that space, as is Amazon and now Google and Microsoft and other major providers. But the idea of cloud computing is it really created a much easier environment for people to build services, build businesses, and deliver those to consumers. And it also allowed for the ability for people to scale, or services to scale in an infinite way. Everything is still centrally controlled, but now centrally controlled from a service provision hub, not necessarily a server that's sitting in your office, but it can manage globally. You can distribute services around the world, and you can get much closer to your customer. On the consumer side, the biggest evolution going into Web2 was mobile. So now suddenly, in the same way that service providers could deliver that service much closer to where you are and make it much more relevant for your geolocation, you actually, with mobile, can take it everywhere you want with you. So you now, as a consumer, can begin to use these services in real time in the real world. So what came of that? Social platforms like Facebook, service providers like Uber, and there are plenty more, and we'll look at a couple more in the next slide. But you can begin to see how the evolution and the complexity of the services being provided became much more of a utility for consumers. So then we move to Web3, and Web3 is obviously a very, very current offering. It dawned in 2008, but the reality is it really didn't start seeing mainstream success until probably in the last few years, last couple of years even. The idea of Web3 is it pulls away from this centralized control of information, data, centralized control of services, and it essentially decentralizes it. It allows it to distribute, allows people to own their own destiny, own their own data, allows them to really manage their own environment and provide service for on their own environment. The whole idea of the corporate overlord that controls everything that you do is really stripped away in a Web3 environment. It's birthed with blockchains like Bitcoin was the first, and then Ethereum, and then now you start seeing Solana, OpenSea, Uniswap, all these much more focused technologies that are all centered around the same kind of blockchain theme. So if we think about that evolution and what it means, Web 1 and Web 2 sat on the same protocol layer. It's all TCP/IP, HTTP, SMTP. But Web 3 has really created a whole new set of core protocol technologies. And the idea is that now you can build technology on a different platform, not necessarily on HTTP. On the infrastructure layer, Web 1 was built from kind of in-house servers. There really wasn't these big server farms and cloud environments, whereby Web 2, you look at AWS from a service provision standpoint, cloud platform, Apple as a distribution mechanism, Shopify as an e-commerce platform. All of these core infrastructure layer protocols have been built to allow people to build businesses on top of them into a Web 2 environment. And as you can see, Netflix, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, all of these companies kind of evolved from that service platform. Finally, as you go to Web 3, your protocol layers are really the core contracts, the core smart blockchains that actually do all the functioning work. But a lot of them are not as functional or as direct as you want them to be for the application that you're trying to launch. So then you begin to see infrastructure layers evolve, like Lightning Labs, which sits on top of Bitcoin and creates an exchange platform that allows you to trade and act with Bitcoin as a true currency. Polygon that services NFTs and services a whole different category of Bitcoin utilization, of crypto utilization. And then on top of that, you have the application layer. And the application layer is where the direct services to consumers take place. And that is the layer that now we're beginning to see, and really is the commercialization of Web3 as a platform. So if we go back to Web 2, like, why did Web 3 happen? Like, why did we even create Web 3? Well, obviously things only happen when there's a hole or a gap in the market. Web 2 had a lot of things that worked very well for it. As I mentioned before, you had a scalable on-demand infrastructure, you had mobile convenience, user experience is really good. There's a broad utility that allowed for a lot of products and services, and it's highly discoverable because it's very centralized and organized. But what's missing is data is controlled by centralized corporations. And so as a result, as a user, you are really subject to the data manipulations of a centralized corporation. And everybody's feeling that now with data privacy and data security and things like that. But it is an environment that has created great gains, but also great concerns in the market. Within Web 2, as a result of that control, these major corporations really sit at the top of the pyramid, and they control everything that happens on the internet. So if you want to put a product on the App Store, on the Apple App Store, you're paying Apple a fee. If you want to sell a product on Amazon, you're paying Amazon a fee. If you want to distribute your food or other delivery services from your retail environments into the consumer's hands, you're paying Grubhub or Uber Eats or one of those other players to actually do that work for you. So these core companies have established these platforms on which everyone can build, but as a result, the cost of building is pretty steep, and the greatest profits obviously land on the platform owners themselves. The final piece that's kind of missing a little bit is the concept of walled gardens. What this means is that, you know, Apple owns its data, Facebook owns its data, Amazon owns its data, and they don't cross-pollinate. So what you do with one environment you can't take your data and use it to benefit you in another place in the internet. And so as a result, it becomes a limited interoperability between platforms. You know, they're all kind of competing and they're not really engaging and interacting very effectively with one another. So as a result, what happened? Web3 was really created. Now, the origins of Web3 go back really to the financial crisis of 2008, when Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a white paper, which was the Bitcoin white paper, and established a different form of currency, a different form of delivering, delivering value across borders without controls of central governments and without the impact of central government, ups and downs and the like. And so Bitcoin was born. And it was born really as a very, very restricted and controlled protocol. And the reason that was is because the only way to keep the money safe was to not allow anybody to influence it. It was built across a highly distributed network of servers, which lived across the whole planet. And as a result, the independence of the servers and the distribution of the data across these servers made it impossible for people to go in and infect or create problems in the service provision. If nodes went down or if nodes were corrupted, they would essentially be replaced automatically because of the balance of nodes across the whole of the blockchain. And so that's created a very tight, restricted environment, which was very good for currency because it was not impacted or could not be manipulated and could not be controlled by any single entity, whether government or corporation. Took a while for Bitcoin to grow, Litecoin, XRP came along, different services came along that obviously helped build the currency component. But it was interesting in the mid-teens where the Bitcoin community began to split. And people began to think of Bitcoin as an opportunity, or blockchain rather, as an opportunity to create multiple services, smart contracts, a lot of things you could do when you're really dealing with digital currency. The community fought and ultimately split, whereas the Bitcoin, loyalists really stuck to the idea that we need a fixed, non-manipulable, manipulatable currency, whereas a lot of innovators felt like, oh no, we need to transform into what ultimately became Ethereum, which was a smart contract platform that allows you to build much more complex applications, much more complex solutions using this form of technology, blockchain. Ethereum was really the dawn of developing applications outside of currency with blockchain. But Ethereum is also expensive to run and slow. And so as a result, evolutions had to happen. Now we've had Ethereum 2.0 come out, but in the meantime, you begin to see other platforms like Solana, Avalanche, that began to build much more effective and much more cost-effective and much more manipulable, malleable technologies that were in general kind of focused towards certain types of application, whether it was DeFi or some other blockchain-driven technology or application that's out there. A lot of people are still built on Ethereum. A lot of technologies that are built as second layers on top of Ethereum. However, you're beginning to see some other layer ones like Solana emerge as more focused, more scalable solutions for building technologies on top of the blockchain. So that's like a brief history of how Web3 originated and how it evolved. There are really 4 core hallmarks of crypto. Provenance being the first one. That's the ability to prove ownership, the records of transfer. You can really understand who owns the asset for the life of the asset. And as a result, economic rights, which allows people who either own currently or have owned historically the ability to be contracted into any returns or any value created out of that asset. Incentive realignment. Now, by using tokens and by using crypto, you can actually give people credit for the contributions they make into a particular business or on a particular platform. And so now the largest contributors actually have the ability to earn and be part of the success of a platform. And then interoperability, your ability to really transport assets across platforms. You can move very freely from one platform to another and execute on different types of transactions or business models depending on where you're moving, what technologies you're moving across. So those are the four core hallmarks of what everyone has been kind of building around in order to make a Web3 world work and make sense. So just some example, we started the whole presentation across the idea of, is it purely currency or is there, an application outside of currency? Well, Lightning Labs is a layer 2 that sits on top of Bitcoin and allows Bitcoin to be used in real-time transactions, cheaper, faster, as opposed to kind of the clunkiness of a traditional Bitcoin transaction. That is really a pure currency play. But then as you begin to look at the other applications that have been built, you're seeing activations in lending, gaming, art, music, wireless, climate, and a bunch of others. We've given just a bunch of examples here. One great example actually is Helium, which is a decentralized wireless network. What this essentially allows you to do as an owner of a wireless hotspot is you can actually make that available to the public to use and then get rewards and benefit and value for the public being able to access your node as a part of the Helium network. So you essentially creating a wireless network globally through the contribution of consumers around the world and through their value contribution into that network. And so that's a really great example of how a very traditional old school telecom infrastructure can be replaced by a fully decentralized solution that all participants can benefit from in the network. And so we go back to kind of another core question. Does Web3 eat Web2's lunch? Like, does it really take over? Well, it doesn't really take over, because with everything I've described so far, you got to understand that different business models have different needs. Web3 is very specific and is best leveraged when the benefits of Web3 exist. What we're seeing today, in all honesty, is a lot of companies that are trying to wedge a Web3 or a tokenization or something into a business model that doesn't necessarily suit Web3. And in those cases, as investors, we have a keen eye to look out for that. And those don't really necessarily belong in Web3, and they don't necessarily have longevity in Web3. They're probably better serviced by Web2. If you think about it, Web2 is much faster, less expensive to run on cloud. There's really, unless you're specifically getting some benefits of decentralization, there's really no point building in a Web3 environment. So just as a review of that, what does that mean? When does a Web2 company make sense in Web3, or to be cryptoized, as they say? I picked 4 companies here. Uber, which is an obvious one that everyone knows. Well, we don't believe that Uber makes sense in a Web3 environment. You could argue that, all drivers should have a piece of the business and benefit, and should be a decentralized ownership. But the thing that makes Uber work is really the centralized control, the orchestration, and also the security that comes with that, the ability to actually create an environment that makes consumers feel secure. Web3 doesn't offer that. And as a result, we don't believe that a business like Uber would really be able to survive in a Web3 environment. DigitalOcean is self-explanatory. It's a cloud infrastructure platform. It could not work on a blockchain because blockchains are much more distributed, much more complex to operate. And as a result, if you really, really want to build a good cloud, you're focused on responsiveness, on the performance and the speed of the network in which you're working on. Being able to go directly into cloud server and do a calculation or a process directly in a cloud server and then straight back out to the consumer is much more effective in a traditional cloud Web2 environment. However, if we look at companies like Upwork, where you're actually allowing people to get projects and do work for the market, for the businesses out there that are looking for service providers, something like that does work. If I'm a contractor and I want to go out and provide my services across the internet, why can't I control my own destiny, be decentralized, earn value in the kind of consulting package or the group that is actually delivering my service to the end consumer. And there's a lot of interesting value that can be ascertained there. Another idea is Sotheby's, and we've seen that a lot obviously with NFT art, but decentralizing the NFT world, the art world, but more importantly, what Web3 does, because it's a transactional record, will allow somebody who has produced a piece of art to sell it and then retain royalties every time it's resold. So these smart contracts really enable a marketplace where anybody that actively participates in that marketplace has the potential to create returns for a very long period of time as those art pieces revolve and are resold and are moved around. I mean, you can definitely look at the artists of old, the Van Goghs of the old, who died without any money at all, and now their pieces are being sold for millions. And if you imagine the ability for an artist to retain for generations of his family, some of the value of his art or her art as that art is, evolves and grows and increases in value. And so really the result is, we believe that, in the same way that Web 2 didn't replace Web 1, it really was a complement to Web 1. So a lot of the Web 1 companies still survived and live in a Web 2 world. Web 3 also doesn't necessarily replace Web 2. It's a complement. There are certain business models and certain solutions that really make sense for a Web 3 environment and don't necessarily work as well in a Web 2 environment. There's certain concerns around data privacy and things that, or data ownership, that are prevalent in Web 2 that Web 3 solves. And in those environments, Web 3 truly makes sense. But then in other solutions, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And we believe that great businesses will continue to be built out of Web 2. So it will not eat its lunch. It will continue to grow and build as a independent technology platform for people to build businesses on top of. And just finally, to close out, before I take a couple of questions, Web3 and just some of the metrics so people understand. Obviously, you can see from this, the explosion of Web3 really began a couple of years ago. The global Web3 market right now is a $1.2 trillion market. That's how many crypto assets are out in the market, and that's a 5x increase, since 2 years ago. 34 million, that's 10% of Americans own crypto in one form or another. And the total value locked in DeFi, which is essentially the financial side of financial tools around crypto, essentially crypto being used as an asset for borrowing or lending or things like that. It's around $54 billion. So it's a pretty meaningful volume of activity in that regard. The leading smart contract blockchain, so not Bitcoin, but the smart contracts, they have about 1.7 million daily active users. These are the people that are actually building technologies on top of these platforms, which means there's a great developer community there. And developers have actually raised about $7.6 billion in funding. So you can imagine what's coming down the road and the amount of great businesses and services that will probably come out of crypto. And so we're very, very excited to see how that evolves and to see what businesses and what value is built out of crypto over the next, decade. So with that being said, I'll say thank you. And if we do have a minute or two, I'd be happy to take a couple of questions.
Thank you. Fascinating. Found it really interesting that as the technology continues to progress, you don't have to necessarily give up the old, and that they can coexist, and that there's really a proper place for each.
Yes.
And your examples were great as to the limitations, as to who may benefit from one over the other. And I think that was fascinating. The Sotheby's example I thought was really interesting, and same with your Van Gogh reference as well. I mean, the whole concept of that future resale. Why, if you're the original creator, why wouldn't you have some sort of, call it a royalty or anything like that? It's kind of like the BMI concept for music writers, right?
Yes,
the song gets replayed.
And that's actually interesting that you reference that, because you take art out of just the canvas form and you talk about music, you talk about writings, you talk about so many different forms of art, and royalties and royalty management and controls live across all of them. And so we do see, even though there is a framework for royalties in music, there are plenty of musicians in the last 50 to 100 years that would claim that their music or their creations have been taken advantage of, and they have not had a smart contract tied to them that has automatically compensated them for the work they've done.
Yeah, you think of like those little snippets you hear at like games and arenas and things, and whether or not they're actually being compensated for that or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully yes, but
Hopefully yes. Hopefully. Well, fascinating. Thank you for having us have the look back and get a great foundation, and certainly a look forward. And certainly your career here, from the investing side and serial entrepreneurship side, has been outstanding. So thank you for your contributions and continued success in the future.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you, Glenn.
Karl, thanks for joining us today. Take good care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.